Welcome to Crime Intelligence. I'm your host, Luna, and today we're going to look at one of the most disturbing and controversial cases in American criminal justice history. Sometimes these scariest stories aren't just about the crimes themselves, but about how justice can go terribly wrong. Back in 1993, in the small town of West Memphis, Arkansas, 3 young boys disappeared. What followed was a nightmare that would grip the nation. A tale of murdered children, accusations of satanic rituals, and 3 teenagers who would become known as the West Memphis 3. This story, it shows us how fear and prejudice can sometimes overshadow truth and reason. It's a case that would eventually expose serious flaws in our justice system and change the lives of everyone involved forever. Stay with me as we uncover the tragic events that unfolded in Robin Hood Hills and the shocking investigation that followed. On May 5th, 1993, in West Memphis, Arkansas, what started as a normal spring evening turned into every parent's worst nightmare. 3 8-year-old boys, Stephen Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, went riding their bikes together after school. When darkness fell and the boys hadn't returned home, their families grew worried and contacted the police. The initial search that night turned up nothing, but the next morning, police found 3 bicycles near a muddy creek in an area known locally as Robin Hood Hills. It was a wooded area where neighborhood kids often played, but that day it became the scene of something horrific. John Fogelman, who was searching the creek, noticed something beneath the water's surface. What he found was, it's hard to even say this, the bodies of all 3 boys. The victims had been stripped naked and hogtied with their own shoelaces. Their bodies showed signs of brutal beating and drowning. Christopher Byers had suffered the worst injuries with severe mutilation. The community was absolutely devastated. West Memphis was a small town of about 28,000 people where everyone kind of knew each other, and nothing like this had ever happened before. The police immediately sealed off the area and began what would become one of the largest investigations in Arkansas history. Police Chief Gary Gitchell took personal control of the case, facing intense pressure from the terrified community to find whoever did this. The media descended on West Memphis, and parents kept their children indoors, scared that a monster was walking among them. The initial evidence was, limited. The crime scene had been partially underwater, and the rain that fell during the night had washed away many potential clues. The police had no obvious suspects, no murder weapon, and very little physical evidence to work with, but what they did have was a community demanding answers, and fast. As the investigation progressed, the police started focusing their attention on 3 local teenagers who stood out in the conservative community of West Memphis. There was Damien Echols, an 18-year-old who had a reputation for being different. He wore black clothing, listened to Metallica, and was interested in Wiccan beliefs. Then there was Jason Baldwin, 16, Damien's best friend, who shared similar interests in heavy metal music. And finally, Jessie Misskelley Jr., 17, who occasionally hung out with them. The police received a tip from a local woman who claimed she'd heard that Echols had something to do with the murders. In a small town like West Memphis, rumors spread fast. The investigators started gathering information about the 3 teens and what they found fit into a narrative they were developing. This was the early 90s when there was this whole satanic panic thing going on across America. They learned that Echols had a history of mental health issues and had previously been hospitalized. He'd written dark poetry and had this interest in occult books. Baldwin was quieter, but was seen as guilty by association. Misskelley lived in a trailer park and had a reputation for getting into fights, though he wasn't particularly close to the other 2. The police began questioning people about the 3 teenagers, and honestly, it seemed like they'd already made up their minds. They weren't really looking at other suspects anymore. They focused on building a case around the idea that these murders were part of some kind of satanic ritual, connecting the teens' interest in heavy metal music and their black clothing to their theory. The investigation took a turn when they brought Jessie Misskelley in for questioning. He had an IQ of just 72, and the police saw him as the weak link they could use to crack the case. They believed if they could get him to talk, they'd have their breakthrough, and that's exactly what they focused on doing, not knowing that this approach would lead to one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. One of the most troubling parts of this case centered on what happened on June 3rd, 1993, when police brought Jessie Misskelley in for questioning. What started as a morning interview stretched into nearly 12 hours of intense interrogation. It's important to mention that Misskelley was just 17 at the time, and he had an IQ of 72, which puts him in the borderline intellectual disability range. During this marathon interrogation session, the police didn't record most of their questioning. Only 2 short fragments, totaling about 45 minutes, were ever documented on tape. Misskelley was questioned without a lawyer or parent present, even though he was a minor. The police used a technique called leading questions, where they basically fed him details about the crime. After hours of questioning, Misskelley finally broke down and gave a confession. But here's the thing. His statement was full of inconsistencies. He initially said the murders happened in the morning when we know the boys were in school at that time. When the police corrected him, he changed his story to match their timeline. He got several other key details wrong too, like how the victims were tied up and the sequence of events. The detectives used what's known as the Reed technique, a controversial interrogation method that's been known to produce false confessions, especially when used on juveniles or people with intellectual disabilities. And they told Misskelley they had evidence that didn't actually exist and promised him he could go home if he just told them what they wanted to hear. When the confession was later examined by experts, they pointed out that most of the accurate details in Misskelley's statement were actually provided to him by the investigators first. You see, they would say something like, "We know this happened," and then Misskelley would agree and incorporate it into his story. Despite these red flags, this confession became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, not just against Misskelley, but it was also used to arrest Echols and Baldwin. Later, Misskelley recanted his confession, saying he had just told the police what they wanted to hear so he could go home, but by then, the damage was already done. The confession had set in motion a chain of events that would change 3 young lives forever. The trials of Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley began in early 1994, with Misskelley being tried separately from the other 2. The prosecution's case was, pretty thin when you really look at it. There wasn't any physical evidence connecting these teenagers to the murders, no DNA, no fingerprints, nothing like that. Instead, they relied heavily on Misskelley's confession, even though he had already recanted it. The thing is, they couldn't even use his confession in Echols and Baldwin's trial because Misskelley refused to testify against them, so the prosecution had to get creative, you could say. They brought in witnesses who claimed they'd heard Echols bragging about the murders at a softball game, but these witnesses later admitted they'd made it up. They also focused a lot on Echols' interest in Wicca and heavy metal music. The prosecution painted him as the ringleader of a satanic cult, playing into the fears of the small religious community. You know what's interesting? They brought in this so-called expert on the occult, Dale Griffiths, who testified about supposed satanic symbols and rituals, but when the defense questioned his credentials, it turned out he'd gotten his PhD from a mail-order university. I mean, he'd never even visited the campus. The prosecution also presented black clothing and heavy metal t-shirts as evidence, suggesting these were somehow proof of satanic worship. They even brought up the fact that Echols had read Stephen King novels, as if that somehow made him capable of murder. The whole thing really played into this satanic panic that was sweeping through America at the time. The defense tried to present evidence about alternative suspects, including one parent who had a history of violence and was seen with muddy clothes on the night of the murders. But the judge wouldn't allow most of this evidence to be heard. Despite the lack of physical evidence and the questionable testimony, the jury found all 3 teenagers guilty. On March 19, 1994, Jessie Misskelley was sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. A few weeks later, Jason Baldwin received life without parole. But the biggest shock came when Damien Echols was sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was just 19 years old at the time. You know, it's kind of crazy to think about. 3 teenagers locked away based on, well, not much at all. But here's where things get interesting. As word about this case spread beyond West Memphis, people started asking questions. A lot of questions, actually. HBO filmed a documentary called Paradise Lost that brought national attention to the case. Musicians like Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam and Henry Rollins started speaking up. They weren't just talking. They were raising money for appeals and new investigations. Then there was this group called Free the West Memphis 3 that kept growing and growing. They had websites, held rallies, and got more people looking into what really happened. And the more people looked, the more problems they found with the original investigation and trials. Some really interesting things started coming out, like there was this hair found at the crime scene that didn't match any of the victims or the 3 convicted teens. And bite marks on the victims, well, forensic experts later said they weren't human bite marks at all. They were probably from animals after the bodies were left in the water. The support kept building. You had celebrities like Johnny Depp and Natalie Maines from the Dixie Chicks speaking out. They weren't just talking about it. They were putting their own money into funding new investigations and legal teams. Even some of the victims' parents who initially believed in their guilt started having doubts. But the Arkansas courts, they kept denying appeals. Year after year, these 3 young men sat in prison while outside support grew and new evidence piled up. The original trial judge even admitted years later that the jury foreman had improperly discussed Misskelley's confession during deliberations in the Echols and Baldwin trial. Remember, that confession wasn't supposed to be considered at all in their case. After 18 years behind bars, things finally started to break. In 2007, new DNA testing came back on hair evidence found at the crime scene, and well, it didn't match Echols, Baldwin, or Misskelley. Actually, it didn't match any of the victims either. Instead, it matched one of the victims' stepfathers and his friend. That was pretty big news. The defense team also found evidence of juror misconduct during the original trials, and get this, some witnesses came forward saying they'd lied in their original testimony. The case was basically falling apart. But Arkansas officials, they were still resistant to admitting any mistakes. Then in August 2011, something unexpected happened. The prosecution offered what's called an Alford plea deal. It's this weird legal thing where you can maintain your innocence but still plead guilty to get out of prison. Kind of confusing, right? But after 18 years in prison with Damien Echols facing execution, they took the deal. So on August 19th, 2011, all 3 walked out of prison as free men. But here's the thing about an Alford plea. Technically, they're still considered guilty in the eyes of the law. They can't sue the state for wrongful imprisonment, and Arkansas doesn't have to admit to any mistakes. The case officially remains closed, even though so many questions are still unanswered. The West Memphis 3 case still haunts Arkansas to this day. It's one of those stories that just stays with you. 3 teenagers lost 18 years of their lives. 3 little boys lost their lives, and their families, they're still waiting for real answers. Looking back, it's pretty clear how fear and panic can just take over a community. The whole satanic panic thing, the rush to judgment, the questionable evidence, it all kind of snowballed, didn't it? And even now, after all these years, we still don't know who really killed those 3 innocent boys in Robin Hood Hills. And that's it. Thanks for hanging out with me today on Crime Intelligence. If this case shows us anything, it's that justice can get pretty messy. Catch you tomorrow for more true crime stories. Until then, stay safe and stay curious, and remember, things aren't always what they seem.